You're listening to Passions and Prologues, a literary podcast where each week I'll interview an author about a thing they love and how it inspires their work. I'm your host, Adam Sokol, and if this is your first time tuning in, thanks so much for joining. Excited to have you here. If you've been here since the beginning, welcome back. We're going to dive into some more spookiness in keeping with our theme from last week with Alexis Henderson. Today's episode is an interview I did with author Rachel Harrison, who wrote the stunning debut novel, The Return, a few years back. Her second novel was called Cackle, and she has a brand new book out called Such Sharp Teeth, which, as Mallory O'Meara described it to me and completely sold me, Rachel Harrison wrote a werewolf book, and that was all I needed to know. She writes stories that are twisty and creepy and uncomfortable in the best possible way. And when you hear this discussion, it will make a lot more sense how she's able to write that way, because her deep passion is for the Twilight Zone. In episode 2 of this podcast with Brad Meltzer, where we talked about the Muppets, he jokingly talked about how he has a shirt that says, "I appreciate the Muppets on a much deeper level than you." That is Rachel with the Twilight Zone. She has an almost photographic memory of the episodes, and she remembers when she first saw them, when she first experienced watching them in bulk, when she used to watch them all throughout college. And the Twilight Zone, for a show, if people aren't familiar with it, it is extremely old, and it was extremely ahead of its time. It was popular in the time, but the reason that it remains so influential now is because of the different stories it told and the underlying themes that each episode had. Rachel very much writes in the same way, and I think you're going to absolutely adore it. I love this conversation. Rachel is someone who, back when The Return came out, I think I was one of the first people who ever interviewed her for it. And she jokingly told me that she had listened to the previous podcast for a long time, and it was really fun. She jokingly said she felt like a fangirl, and now I am a total fanboy anytime I get to talk to Rachel. A complete delight. You're really going to love this discussion, but first I want to give you a book recommendation. I am currently reading a book called Witches by Brenda Lozano, and it is translated by Heather Cleary. I am loving this book. It came out in 2020, and it is a short book. It's under 300 pages, and it weaves two parallel narratives. One of them is about Feliciana, who is an indigenous healer, and Zoe, who is a journalist telling her life story. The two women meet after the murder of Feliciana's cousin, Paloma, and this is told from a small town in Mexico where they deeply believe in these genuine healing capabilities of what we would consider witches, or as what they call curanderas. And in addition to that, Feliciana also happens to be a trans woman. And it's just, the whole story is beautiful. Like I said, it's told throughout Mexico and the world. It's a really, really captivating novel, and it's so powerful. I'm really, really loving it, and the way that it's written is very unique. It takes a page or two to get into the writing, but as soon as you do, you forget that you're reading words, and you just genuinely see the story in your mind. So it's a beautiful book so far. I'm really loving it. That's Witches by Brenda Lozano, translated by Heather Cleary. As a reminder, if you're new or if you haven't done this yet, if you leave me a rating or review, send me a screenshot of that to passionsandprologues@gmail.com and let me know what you're currently reading. I will give you a customized book recommendation. As I talked about last week on Book Gang with Amy, the more that you review podcasts that you appreciate and tell other people, the better it is for us. Obviously, the more people that listen in, we are able to sustain creating these podcasts all on our own. So if you have enjoyed any of the conversations I have shared with you or any of the book recommendations over these last couple of weeks, I hope you'll consider just taking a moment to leave a review, share it on social media, share it with a friend, whatever it might be. I really, really appreciate it. You can always tag me on Instagram or TikTok at Passions and Prologues. I know you hear podcasters say this all the time, but it truly does help us kind of be able to keep doing this and spread the word. So, okay, that is all the housekeeping. You guys are in for an absolute treat. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Rachel Harrison, author of Such Sharp Teeth, Passions and Prologues. I'm going to let you tell everybody, Rachel Harrison, what is the thing that you're super passionate about that we're going to dive into today?
Today, we're going to talk about the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, we are. So I listened back to the interview that we did a long time ago for the Professional Book Nerds, the previous podcast I was on, and you briefly mentioned the Twilight Zone. So I was like, there's a little more of this making sense to me now that I listened back. But tell our listeners, when did you first discover the Twilight Zone?
So I was thinking back because it feels like it was just always a part of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to think back to what my earliest memory of watching it was. And I think I was about 9 years old and I was on the couch with my mom. And either she had brought up Eye of the Beholder and kind of explained it to me, or we turned on the TV and it was on. And then I remember when I was watching it, I knew what was going to happen, which was almost worse because I was sitting there anticipating the pig people, as my mother described them to me. But even knowing what the twist was, the amount of dread that I had, and how, I think because I'd never seen something with such a brutal twist before, because I'd seen, when I was young, I saw Alien, I saw Jaws. I was exposed to darker movies, genre movies, but there was never a big pull of the rug and then just leaving the character in a bad spot or an uncertain fate. And so that melted my adolescent brain. Most of what I was consuming as a kid, it's happy endings. In Fern Gully, Hexus is vanquished. It's not but in an episode of the Twilight Zone, Hexus would win. And so to me, it was just it completely shifted how I viewed story. And that was a game changer.
So after you watched that first one, because I remember you are famously afraid of everything, which is why you're a good horror writer. After you watched that first episode, did you then proceed to continue watching Twilight Zones by yourself, or kind of after seeing that first one, how did you engage with this content, I guess, after that initial introduction?
This was probably around 2000, 2001. It's not like I had access to I could turn on Netflix and immediately watch them all.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure that I had to wait until the 4th of July marathon to watch more, because the next memory I have is watching during the 4th of July marathon. And the episode is, I think it's called The Lateness of the Hour, where it's a daughter and she's her parents are there and her dad's a brilliant inventor and they have robot servants. And then by the end of the episode, she figures out that she's screaming, "I'm a machine." And she's banging her arms and saying, "No pain," which is so dark. But that was the next one I remember seeing. And it was definitely during the 4th of July marathon. It's probably a good thing that I couldn't just turn on Netflix and binge them all, because I'd probably be
yeah, that's not a show that
too much all at once. I did sit for the marathon, and then from that time on, every 4th of July and every New Year's Eve, I would watch the marathons. And the marathons are so great because you don't have a choice of what episode comes on, so you kind of skip around in time and get what you get. And then when I went to college, my best friend was also a huge Twilight Zone fan. So we would say random quotes to each other. And as I think I got the box set of DVDs, and then it came on Netflix. And so I'm pretty sure I still watch the marathons because it's just different. If you can stream them, then you kind of pick and choose. And I like the kind of surprise of being oh, this episode, even if it's not one of your favorites. But I'm pretty sure I've seen them all.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I know what you mean though about the marathon, because I'm a little bit older than you, but I remember growing up when I was same thing, 9 or 10. And I had this best friend, Kurt, who lived like right down the street from me. And so our moms were both teachers at the same school. And like, they definitely let us like Sunday nights, we would do sleepovers when like normally that would just, kids wouldn't do that type of thing. But like we would have sleepovers all the time. And like they had a basement and a really small, I want to say it was like a 12 or 14-inch TV. And because we were in the basement and you're 9 or 10, it's that time of life when you feel like when you're watching something, you're like getting away with it. Like you shouldn't be watching it. And so like every Friday the 13th, for example, like I remember like there would be those marathons of like the Friday the 13th movies. And like you said, you would just kind of watch what came on. But I do specifically remember Twilight Zone episodes coming on when it was like, 2 a.m. when you're 10 years old and shouldn't be awake, and watching this like creepy black and white, like out of time show and feeling like I was like getting away with something. How am I watching this thing? And then like you said, not having a choice in what I was watching, but then having my little mind just explode from what I was watching. Like, was that something where obviously you watched the first one with your mom, but like, was it something that your parents were like, yeah, go ahead and watch it? Or what, did you have that same feeling of like, I shouldn't be doing this?
No, my mom was pretty kind of like, watch what you want, especially when it came to like genre stuff. Again, like I saw Jaws and Alien very young, and I'm grateful that she exposed me to these things young. But I think also something about Twilight Zone is because it's black and white and it's an older show, like there's no profanity, there's no like, it seems a little more innocent. I felt more like an artiste, like I'm watching this like old black and white thing, like being young and being like, I'm doing like, I'm not melting my brain with cartoons. I'm melting my brain with Rod Serling.
Well, and what's so interesting about that is like, I was doing some research on this because I remembered like as soon as you told me like, hey, do you want to talk about the Twilight Zone? I remember like I looked up some research because I was trying to think about, I was like, there's something that's stuck in my mind about Rod Serling being like really forward thinking about like societal stuff. And there's actually this like pretty famous interview now where when he's just launching the Twilight Zone, and the person who's interviewing them, I don't remember who it is, but they were like talking down about this idea of this show because it was this like genre science fiction fantasy thing. And they were like, well, you're no longer writing serious like teleplays like he was doing. And like there's Rod Serling has like this look on his face, like, just wait. And because he talks about like racism and like McCarthyism and like all these different things that you wouldn't think would be on TV in like the 50s when the show came out. And like he tried multiple times to put in like stories about Emmett Till being wrongfully murdered like into stories of the Twilight Zone, but he was able to do it in a way that, like you said, it's like there's no swearing, there's no like, it was so masked with like the fantasy and sci-fi that he was able to kind of like shine a light on stuff, but in a way that was on TV then. Like there's some stuff that I'm even surprised. Like I feel like even now people wouldn't come out as easily and blatantly be like, look at how racist this country is. And like he kind of was able to do that. I don't know. Were those things that maybe when you're in college watching it, like were you picking up on those things? Because I feel like at first I definitely wasn't when I was watching them as a kid.
Yeah, I think it really opened my mind to genre because I think you can talk about things in genre and confront things in genre. You can make it more accessible because people are more willing to watch something if it's genre and not really understand that they're picking up on certain like important comments about society or humanity. I mean, Twilight Zone is really a show about our greatest fears and biggest hopes and humanity. I think of like people are alike all over with the human zoo. It's telling a very sad human story, but like it's about aliens on another planet. And so I don't know if when I was a kid, I really picked up on how profound it was, but I could definitely understand the bigger themes. And then a little bit more so in college and just the things that I've read about Rod Serling over the years and being very just impressed with how ambitious he was and his integrity with the show is really impressive. And I think as any artist to read about him and watch his interviews and to witness that integrity it's really something.
Yeah. And like I said, the interview I was watching where they were kind of like mocking this concept of the show that he was going to create, it really makes me think a lot of writing like a first novel or creating a first album as a band, or like as someone who, like, personally, I just finished my first manuscript of a novel that I'm like starting the process of querying and everything. And it's like, I feel like a thing is only a crazy idea until it happens. And like, that's what I feel like with the Twilight Zone. Like, it was something that was looked at as this like crazy idea, and then he created it, and now you look like it's influenced, God, countless things. Like off the top of my head, like, like every M. Night Shyamalan movie, Black Mirror, Are You Afraid of the Dark from when I was a kid. Like all these things were basically versions of the Twilight Zone, and it was a show that only ran for 5 years, I think. Like the initial
and the initial run,
and like I'm like you, I'm like blown away by his just sheer like because like he wrote basically all of the episodes, and he did like so much of the stuff. Like,
it was very much his show. Yeah.
It's just, I don't know. To me, like, I continue to be just like blown away by that. I remember we kind of talked about this in our last chat, which is a long, long time ago. It was for The Return. It was like 2 books ago at this point for you. But, when you were watching it, like, how did the Twilight Zone influence you wanting to kind of become a writer and like your initial early works?
I think I always wrote. I think the Twilight Zone kind of screwed me at the beginning because everything, and because it was the Twilight Zone and the fact that I went to school for screenwriting, because when I started to write prose, everything I wrote, I wanted to be super high concept and have a big twist.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're starting from that point, I think you can shoot yourself in the foot a lot. I think it needs to start with, what do I want this story to be about? Who are these characters? And then if you can come up with a high concept to serve your characters and the story you're trying to tell, that's great. And if there's a twist there, cool. But if you're just like, oh yeah, I'm going to have a big twist, I think it's hard to pull off. At least it was for me. I wasn't talented enough, I guess, to start from that point. So I think it took me a while to find a good balance of having that inspiration of wanting. Because then the thing about the Twilight Zone that I really appreciate is how effective the setups are. Like within the first, 2-3 minutes, the stakes, the characters, what's happening. And then the way the twist is executed at the end, every episode essentially follows a formula, but they're not formulaic. One is different. So that is something I really appreciate about the show. And I think breaking down the show instead of being like, oh, it's like a big twist, because the show is a lot more than that. And like we talked about, it always is every episode is trying to say something about human nature, about, humanity as a whole. And I think the reason the show works is because it has something to say, not because, yes, it's a cookbook is the greatest moment and it's amazing, but it's sooner or later will all be on the menu. That's the takeaway from the episode. As I got older and as I wrote more and as I failed more, I think I could see it for what it was and have my inspiration from the show be a little bit more nuanced in how I incorporated it into my work. Because I wouldn't say that The Return was super influenced by the Twilight Zone, but if it were, it might not be about female friendship in the way that I had initially set out to write. It would have been about, well, she's not the same when she comes back. It would be more focused on that. So it took me a while as a writer to kind of figure out how I wanted to say what I wanted to say, and, that it was more important to have something to say than to just put something out there for shock value or entertainment, purely entertainment. But I think the Twilight Zone, more specifically, like episodes I can see in my work, how it's influenced, and particularly my short stories. Because for me in a novel, I marvel at thriller writers and people who are able to like pull off big twists, but in a novel, but that's not something I would even know how to approach. That's not my wheelhouse. So, but in my shorter works, I think I'm able to kind of be like, okay, again, following the Twilight Zone, this is the setup, and like not necessarily maybe a big twist, but like this is how I want it to end, with this like really punchy moment, and to also not to leave maybe a little ambiguity in my novels. In novels in general, I think it's tough to leave ambiguity because you might leave the readers feeling unsatisfied. But in short fiction, it's less of an investment for the reader. So if there is kind of a dark or ambiguous ending, I think it's a little bit easier to pull that off without having the reader feel like, what?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I listened to, at like the height of the pandemic, I watched a talk. Neil Gaiman and I think Marlon James were talking about short story writing. And one of them said, like, you want to write a short story as if you're writing chapters 39 and 40 of a book, which I thought was interesting. But I like to think of it more as like, if there's 40 chapters in that book, a short story to me is more like chapters 38 and 39, because, and that kind of makes me think of the Twilight Zone, where it's like, there's a story before the screen shows us what's happening. Same thing with like a short story. Like there was a world, like it's like you're taking a quick peek into this world, and then you're going to jump out of it. And like you said, like you can be a little bit ambiguous and be like, I wonder what happens next. But that's the point of a short story, is like you're getting a small snippet where, yeah, like a novel. And like, let's be honest, like if someone pays $28.95 for a novel or whatever it is, like, especially if it's going to be a standalone, like it can feel like you're getting the rug pulled out from under you, where if you're just like, wow, I really hope you enjoyed this buildup. Sorry, you're not going to get closure in this. It's like, I feel like a novel is more so all of those 40 chapters where you're telling the whole like you're telling a whole full complete story more often than not. Yeah, I think you're right. Like the Twilight Zone, it was a 30, the balance of the shows were 30 minutes with commercials. So he had 23 minutes to tell a story where he had something to say, and also was like pulling the rug out from under you in like such a way where you're like, holy shit, what just happened? It's, it's a little bit harder to do that over 400 pages of a novel, I think, because you, like you said, you have more space to play in, but you have more space to fill as well. Yeah.
And if you're with a character for that many pages, if you don't know what happens to them, you're probably going to be a little pissed. In a short story, if you leave them, and I mean, a lot of the Twilight Zone episodes were based on short fiction.
Yeah.
It's a Good Life, which I think is one of the scariest episodes. One, because creepy children are just in general, like, 10 out of 10 scary. And just the that tension of like faking, like, it's a good day, or you're like that kind of. I think the story is also called It's a Good Life by Jerome Bixby. And that one sticks in my mind. One, because it's scary. Like the human Jack in the Box is just so probably creepy. The most terrifying thing ever. But also because when I was writing Cackle, I was thinking of the episode, and I went back and read the short story, which is also really wonderful. Because I wanted, in Rowan, the town that Cackle is set in, I wanted there to be that kind of Anthony Fremont vibe about Sophie, where everyone's like nice to her, but like underneath that niceness, there's like a fear.
Yeah.
So that was a direct influence, and the episode worked as a whole, and the story works as a whole. But I think if you dragged that out over, like, if that story was a novel, or if that episode was a movie, I think it would have gotten old to be like, oh yes, Anthony, it's a good day. Like that would have gotten, and so
over and over.
In Cackle, it definitely had to be like, okay, this is an influence, but it can't be too much of that. Otherwise, I think it'd get a little bit obnoxious of just, golly gee, Sophie, everything's great.
Entirely unrelated, but I had to abandon a fantasy novel because it was like a elvish, like fae type story, which I haven't read much of lately, but like the person kept calling the significant other in it their mate. And they said the word mate over and over, and like, my mate was doing this and I couldn't get away from my mate. And I finally was like, okay, this singular word. I'm going to drop this. This is apropos of nothing, but it just made me think of that. You're absolutely right. Like having something continuously that is a little grating. It's like you can do it in a short story or an episode of Twilight Zone, but you can't have.
It might not be sustainable. There's a careful balance of something being really effective and something like, as soon as it's not effective anymore, it can make or break the work.
Yeah.
So it's a delicate balance. And I mean, in my early attempts at writing, I think my writing definitely suffered because I was like too focused on the concept or the twist or like that aspect of it. And yeah, it can easily fail if you go too heavy-handed.
We'll be back with more Passions and Prologues after this break.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I want to tell you about my podcast called Can I Offer You Some Feedback? I'm a business consultant and executive coach with over 20 years experience in change management, leadership development, and naturally providing feedback to high performers. My podcast is for those of you who have a complicated relationship with feedback, whether giving, receiving, avoiding, or seeking. Feedback is essential for our development. In each episode, you'll hear from real people across industries with their ideas, perspectives, and best practices on feedback. I'll also be sharing business bites with you, simple explanations of organizational tools, management techniques, and leadership philosophies that will help you and your businesses thrive. You can listen to Can I Offer You Some Feedback on your favorite podcast app or learn more at evergreenpodcasts.com.
And now, back to Passions and Prologues.
So along those lines, for you, where does an origin of a story start then? Is it a concept of, and we'll get to your next book in a second here, but like, is it the concept of like, oh, you want to tell a werewolf story? Or like, for you, where does the story kind of start? Because with the Twilight Zone, and I'm guessing for Rod Serling here, but I'm guessing he probably started with like the thing he wanted to say about society, write that story, then he'll find the twist. But like for you, where does it start?
See, it used to start just at concept, and now it really starts where concept meets what I'm trying to say. I think it's, again, more evident in my short fiction. I have a collection coming out this fall called Bad Dolls. And like in that collection, there's a story about a bad doll, very like Talkie Tina or the Dummy episode of the Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
But it's about self-loathing and grief and loss. And there's a story, I guess it's probably easier for me to give an example about the first story in the collection, which is called Reply Hazy. And that origin story was, I was like, what if there was like a magic 8-ball and like somebody was really indecisive about big decisions in their life? Because I can be very indecisive. And like, well, what if I had a magic 8-ball and I asked this magic 8-ball everything and like relied on this magic 8-ball? And that's kind of where the origin of the story came. And for Such Sharp Teeth, I was thinking, I remember I was having a day where I was just like, it never gets easier to be in your body. Like there's never a time, like you go through puberty and you think like, you know, well, once you get through puberty and then like, there's always something in a body.
Yeah.
And I was also thinking a lot about womanhood, and like, I remember being like, how come there's not more lady werewolf stories? Because once a month change, like it just seemed like having no control over your body.
Yeah.
It just seemed like I wanted to explore that. And that's kind of how it came about. It wasn't like the things kind of come hand in hand. If I have like a concept that comes to me, what the story is about kind of needs to come right with it. Or if I want to talk about something, the concept needs to be right behind it. If I just have a concept, or if I'm just like, I want to vent about this thing, like it probably won't work. They need to come together at the same time.
No, that makes sense. And I'll have you an introduction to Such Sharp Teeth. I'm still getting back into the reps of doing podcasting, and I definitely should have had you talk about the book as opposed to like the concept of it. But I'll let you do that now for people who might not have heard of it, because as we're recording, the book isn't yet out, so people might not be aware of it.
It's strange because I feel like at a certain point, like before, when The Return came out, and I would go on podcasts and they'd be like, "What's the book about?" I'd be like, "Good question." Like I just you write it, but you don't have that like pitch about it. And so
I'm working on that right now for myself. Yeah.
Before I went out with Cackle, like before I started doing podcasts, I like wrote a little snippet, and I haven't yet done that with Such Sharp Teeth. So this might be a little mangled, but it's about Rory, who is 27 years old. She lives in New York City. She has a high-powered business job. She is free-spirited. She likes to party, likes to meet new people. She returns to her hometown reluctantly when her twin sister Scarlett asks her, because Scarlett is pregnant and estranged from her baby's father and needs some emotional support. And Rory and Scarlett would do anything for each other. So Rory comes home and she's not particularly jazzed about being back in her hometown. She doesn't have fond memories of being there. She really wanted to get out and never go back. One part of her hometown that surprises her is she runs into Ian, who was basically like in love with her when they were kids. And Rory was kind of like, we're friends, but like, I don't have boyfriends. Like, I have fun. And she reconnects with him one night at a bar, and maybe now she might have feelings for him. But on the drive home, she hits a creature with her car. And when she gets out to investigate, she is attacked. And yeah, it's not a spoiler alert to say that she is attacked by a werewolf. And she starts to transform. And it's really a book about vulnerability and rage. You know, I think all my books are kind of coming of age stories, just instead of adolescence, you know, in your 20s. It's got some good old fashioned body horror and some dark humor and maybe a little bit of a love story. So yeah, and it comes out October 4th.
See, what I love about your books is, and I was thinking about this because we're recording this at the end of April, and I was listening to the Reading Glasses podcast, which a mutual friend of ours, Mallory O'Meara, is one of the co-hosts on, and she is reading an advanced reader copy of your book right now. And I know this because I was listening to the podcast, and she said, she's like, I'm going to describe the book. She said, I'm going to sell the book to all of our listeners in one sentence. Rachel Harrison wrote a lady werewolf novel. And I think about that with The Return, where it's like Rachel Harrison wrote to boil it down, you could be like, wrote like a creepy haunted house novel, which is not at all what it is, but like you could say that and to kind of sell people on it. And then I also love that, like, I feel like every one of your books there can be like a sentence pitch that you could just be like, this is what it's about. And people be like, oh my God, I need to know more about that. But then, like you said, there's always going to be things under the surface about, like you said, vulnerability and relationships and these different things that, like, I know I love that every one of your books, while being terrifying, also has these human elements and like these like relationships and these gigantic things going on the outside, but it's also about the people, if that makes sense. Like that's the type of book I like seek out, is like, give me the wild shit on the periphery, but let it be about these like people and their relationships.
Yeah, I like to write a lot about relationships.
Mm-hmm.
That's fun for me. And you know, my previous books, it was a lot of female friendship, and there's still female friendship in Such Sharp Teeth, but there's also, you know, a love interest and family relationships. And I'm trying to challenge myself with each book to do something a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you spend so much time on a manuscript, like you want to be interested in it personally as the person who's doing it, right? Like,
yeah, that's, I think, where the like humor in my books comes from. Like if it's all dark, then I'm not going to want to sit with it for however long you need to sit with it. So
yeah, I actually found myself doing that in my like day job writing. I work for a tech company and I write about a engineering insights platform, not the most exciting stuff to write about. So I'll be writing these reports and I can like feel myself coming unhinged, and like I'll be writing this copy that I know it's like the zero draft. I'm thinking about it as I was working on my manuscript too. I was like, this is zero draft. This copy probably isn't going to stay in here, but it's also not going to be like the reason people don't read those reports. I'll be writing this copy and I can just feel myself losing my mind a little bit. And then I'll send it to my manager and she'll be like, hey, what time did you write these last 4 paragraphs?
I used to work for like a big corporate bank, and I was an administrative assistant in the legal department. And I remember I'd been there for a few weeks and we were doing like an office move. And I made like a reel, too real, I like to move it joke in an email. And I got home and I told my husband, it's like, nobody responded to my joke. And he was like, well, and he was like not paying attention, doing something else. And he was like, well, maybe it wasn't very funny. And so I was like, I'm funny. And so I worked there for like 4 years, and I would just do like little stuff that no one would comment on. But like the joke was for me.
Yeah.
Like there was one day where I printed out pictures of, there's like a lot of pictures on the internet of kids pressing their face into glass.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like printed out a bunch of those pictures and I just taped it to the inside of glass on people's desks.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just funny, the amount of people who were like laughed about it. And then the people who just totally ignored it.
Yeah. So that's literally me and like these reports that I'm writing. There was one that it was like a 20-page report about like upskilling data, and like for people who are interested in it, it's very interesting, but I was getting bored by the end of it, and I wrote this like 3-paragraph kind of like a horror story thing. I was like, upskilling isn't like a boogeyman, and then I got really, really visceral about like what it's like, slashing your like tech workforce and everything. And one of the people was like, I like where you're going with this, but maybe not. And then someone else was like, okay, clearly you're losing your mind and this is very funny. And then a third person was just like, please delete this and write the copy that you know. Yeah. I was like, all right, okay, everybody.
Corporate, when you're a creative person in a like corporate environment, especially for me, I walked in, I wasn't like in this job out of college.
Yeah.
Like I'd worked in TV, I'd worked in publishing. And to kind of like shift gears and come into this environment, it's like, oh, this vibe is different. Like, I need to adapt to what people are doing here.
Mm-hmm.
Just suppress my personality as much as possible so I keep my job.
Yeah. And to be fair, like the place that I'm working is wonderful. And they actually like, they hired me because of like the creativity and kind of like different way that I look at things. And most projects, they're like super cool. Like I wrote a blog about like software development, but the theme of it was the Great British Bake Off. And like they're totally cool with me doing stuff like that. But there are some reports where they're like, we need like 15% less Adam in this.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's fair.
Okay, fair. Yeah, those people are not wrong.
Yeah.
It's just funny. It's just a funny thing.
I have a very important question for you.
Okay.
So in our last conversation, you told me, and I want to say this verbatim so I don't get it wrong. No, it's great. You told me that The Shining was like the drunk uncle of The Return. So what is the drunk uncle of such sharp teeth?
Maybe An American Werewolf in London.
Okay.
I would say like I kind of, when I was writing Such Sharp Teeth, it felt a lot like Ginger Snaps meets like Fleabag kind of.
That's an awesome side by side, by the way. You should put that on the back of the book. That's fantastic.
Ginger Snaps is obviously a very big influence. And I really loved Fleabag and just the balance of a character who is really comfortable in her sexuality, but like also underneath it all vulnerable, and the sister dynamic in both Fleabag and Such Sharp Teeth. And obviously the like really hot love story. There's no hot priest in Such Sharp Teeth, but I just thought it was such a perfectly executed love story. But if I had to say like drunk uncle, it would probably be An American Werewolf in London, just because I watched that transformation scene like 10,000 times. It's so good and so visceral and just the best effects ever. And so that I watched a lot, and that was like a big influence. And tonally kind of, horror, but a little bit of comedy and brutal, but not too heavy. Yeah, I'll go with An American Werewolf in London.
Love it.
Yeah. But like a classy drunk uncle. Like he's like drunk off gin.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, I think The Shining was like straight up drunk uncle. Like he smells like, Budweiser and, whiskey. Yeah. This guy's a little bit, they're different kinds of uncles. We all know.
Yeah, we know the different, like the fun at parties drunk uncle versus the like, don't let that uncle come over to Christmas. He's going to ruin the holiday.
Yeah. Like the tree's going down. He's going down.
Exactly.
There might be a fire. Yeah.
All right. Last question for you. I'm having everybody kind of end the conversations with giving a recommendation. It could be a book, music, food, movie. I'm not going to let you use the Twilight Zone because that's what we talked about for the bulk of this conversation. But like, what is just like a piece of media that you're really loving lately that you think people should check out?
I am a Mitski super fan, so I would recommend her latest album, Laurel Hell, which I listen to on repeat, particularly Stay Soft. That's probably one of my favorite her songs. But yeah, any of her albums, I'm a huge Mitski super fan. And then I also watched Breaking Bad for the first time, which it was a little too late.
Okay.
But I remember watching it, like trying to watch it in my early 20s and being like, this is too stressful. But like now I'm old and I have like other things in my life that are legit stressful. Like I was like, it's tax season, and like watching Walter White almost get caught by the DEA. I'm like, this is like a nice brain vacation for me. Like, you think you're stressed, Mr. White? You try doing your taxes. So if somebody has not yet watched Breaking Bad, you know, at some point I had the attitude where I was just like, I can't watch every show.
Yeah.
But it was worth watching, I would say, particularly in the second or third episode of season 1, there's like something really brutal that happens in a bathtub that I just think is like such bold storytelling and just so gross and wonderful. So that's what I'll recommend. Oh, and then I should do a book too. I have been behind on my like reading the books that are coming out because I get books to blurb. And so I'm like ahead, but also behind at the same time, which is really hard for me as a Virgo. The Hacienda by Isabel Canas. That is a great book that comes out, I think, May. And maybe when this podcast airs, these books will have been out for a while.
Yeah. So this will be out in June. So yeah, that's perfect.
And I'm dying to read The Fervor by Amakatsu.
Somebody, one of my Instagram pals, Tina from TBR, etc., she did like a post about it. And she's doing a giveaway copy. And as her friend, I knew I wasn't going to get that giveaway copy. And I was so salty because I was like, oh my God, how did you get your hands on one of those? Yeah, I'm right there with you on that.
I have mixed feelings about giveaways because the first giveaway they did for the return, my ex-boyfriend sent me a picture and he's like, I won. And I was like, no, I'm never doing this again.
No.
I mean, we're on good terms. It wasn't like a creepy ex, but I was just like, of all people, if you don't deserve this copy, you go buy one.
I think my favorite example of that is there's a young adult author, Ryan LaSala, who is incredible, and he'll be on the podcast too. He, for his first book, he accidentally won his own Goodreads giveaway. And he's like, I don't think I should get this. I'm pretty sure I have 15 arcs behind me of this. But yeah. But I'm right there with you with Amakatsu. I would read a phone book version of a book that they created. Like, I'm just so on board for the new one. Well, Rachel, I was so excited when you said yes to do this, and even more excited when you said you want to talk about the Twilight Zone. It's such a unique and like interesting part of like our culture, and like the stuff that it's influenced is just so wide ranging, and I see aspects of it in your writing, and I was so excited to get to talk about it with you. But more importantly, just thank you for saying yes and deciding to do this with me.
Of course, I would chat with you anytime. And yeah, the Twilight Zone is just, it's so enduring, and to have a work that's just as relevant today as it was back then is both heartening and heartbreaking at the same time. But for anyone who hasn't watched it, I highly recommend it. It holds up completely. And it's amazing that something that, came out so long ago, you can watch an episode with a twist and still be shocked. And like the first episode I ever saw, Eye of the Beholder, you can know what the twist is and have it still be really powerful and scary.
Passions and Prologues is proud to be an evergreen podcast and was created by Adam Sokol. It was produced by Adam Sokol and Sean Rule Hoffman. And if you are interested in this podcast and any other evergreen podcast, you can go to evergreenpodcast.com to discover all the different stories we have to tell.